Oh, good morning, Protege. Of course, good afternoon to my wonderful 8th period class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be, sadly, the very last direct instructional Zoomcast for Unit 1, Second Industrial Revolution, Gilded Age, and of course, the Progressive Era. So let's make it a great one. Let's get it. Oh, there we go. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So you again should have your ISN open and ready to take some really good copious notes. I'm going to share my screen with everybody right now. What I would also want to remind everybody is you need a blue or black pen. You are not allowed to take notes in pencil. You need a couple of different colored highlighters. We're going to start highlighting again in multiple colors at this juncture of the year, and correctable tape. But remember, don't be highlighting as you're taking notes. You need to wait till after you're done, because that will allow you to really focus your undivided attention on the Zoomcast. And then, of course, you're taking your really good notes. Once it's done, then you're going to go back with the highlighter and your correctable tape, clean up your work, highlight to really reinforce that information. Highlighting is a natural, organic way to study and develop mastery. All right. So ladies and gentlemen, what I want you to do is make certain, of course, as I stated, you need to date your notes again for today. It is Tuesday and it's October 5th, 2021. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to be talking about the accomplishments of Theodore Roosevelt, or if you prefer Roosevelt, the first of our three great progressive presidents, as you're going to learn about through the President's Matrix. That would be Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Thomas Woodrow Wilson. All right, so again, I'm going to say this again and again and again and again. I repeat myself intentionally. I love these Zoomcasts because I love when I walk around the room. And even though you guys are all kind of at the same spot or the same place, but some of you might be a little bit further ahead. Some of you might be a little bit further behind, and that's okay. You're only in competition with you. And in addition, remember, there's going to be times I am going to go a little faster. But the beauty is you can pause the Zoomcast. If you miss something, rewind it, play it again. I would watch these Zoomcasts more than one time. You only have to take one set of notes, but the more you watch it, the greater understanding and mastery you develop. So before we actually get into the accomplishments, here's what I want you to do. I want you to skip a full page, and I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. So before we get into my direct instructional notes, I'm going to share back-to-back video clips for you guys. So make certain that you date your notes for today. Again, it's October 5th, 2021. And I want you to write down for me video clip Theodore Roosevelt's speech 1916. So this is actual footage, and you'll actually hear the man himself speaking. So this is Theodore Roosevelt giving a speech, again, outside his home in Sagamore Hill. This is in, of course, New York, the great state of New York, where he was born and raised. This is, again, 7 years now after Theodore Roosevelt had stepped down as our first progressive president and as our nation's 26th president of the United States of America. So let me give you a couple of guide questions. So number one, I'm going to go through these rapidly. So if I'm going too fast, pause the Zoomcast. One, I want you to describe for me TR's speaking style. Remember, he was the first president that went by his initials, TR. The next president who went by his initials, a guy by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was known as FDR. Coincidence? I think not, because Franklin Roosevelt was the younger cousin, much younger cousin of Theodore, whom he greatly looked up to. And then number two, it's not a lengthy speech. What was the point that Theodore Roosevelt was making in this particular speech? So again, this is Theodore Roosevelt speaking to a group of individuals on his porch at Sagamore Hill, 1916. This is May. So this is, again, over 7 years after he had stepped down as our first progressive president. So here we go.
The great fundamental issue now before our people to be stated. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not. I believe in the right of the people to it. I believe that the majority of the plain people of the United States will, day in and day out, make fewer mistakes in governing themselves than any smaller class or body of men, no matter what their training, will make in trying to govern. I believe again that the American people are as a whole capable of self-control and of learning by their mistakes. Our opponents pay lip loyalty to this doctrine, but they show their real beliefs by the way in which they champion every device to make the nominal rule of the people a sham. I am not leading this fight as a matter of aesthetic pleasure. I am leading because somebody must lead, or else the fight would not be made at all.
So the speech gets cut up at that point, but you get the gist of it. So again, just a couple of takeaways. Number one, nice speaking style, not overly dynamic, but you notice he kept talking about, my other observation is the people and his faith that he had in the American people. And this was something that absolutely dovetails back to when he was president from 1901 till he stepped down in 1909. All right, so what I want you to do is I want you to skip a full page, go to the right side, the next clean sheet of paper, and don't worry, we're going to come back to those first set of notes that when we talk about his accomplishments, we're just getting warmed up. We're going to go back to it. So here's the other video clip I'm going to share. It's a back-to-back one. So once again, you're going to date your notes for October 5th, Rocktober 5th, 2021, 2 for Tuesday, 2 for Tuesday. And you're going to write down for me guide questions, Theodore Roosevelt. So PBS did a great series on the Roosevelts, on both Theodore and on his younger cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. Outstanding. Highly recommend if you have an opportunity to watch more of it. It's really everything PBS does is always done very, very well. I believe Ken Burns was the director and the producer of it. And Ken Burns, again, does these great documentaries, docudramas going back to when he did the Civil War back in the 1990s. So this is, again, a relatively short video clip. So what do I want you to write down? Number one, Theodore Roosevelt loved to write a lot. He was an author of multiple books. But what I'd like to know is, based on this video clip, how many letters did Theodore Roosevelt write? Again, in the video, they talk about how Thomas Jefferson, our third president, was such a prolific writer, which he was. Remember, Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. But wait till you hear how much Theodore Roosevelt wrote. Number two, how many books did Theodore Roosevelt read? And like, for example, some people read a book a year. Some people are able to read a book in a week or two, maybe a month. How many books did he read? And how fast could he read? Wait till you hear this. Keep in mind, Theodore Roosevelt had a photographic mind, meaning he could sit there and read a book, and then 2 weeks later, he could recite a passage from the book somewhere in the middle. I can't do that. Very few people can. Theodore Roosevelt was remarkable. Based on this video clip number 3, and remember to skip a couple lines between every guide question, as we always do. So I want you to describe for me Roosevelt's personality. This video clip does a nice job of tying together things that I talked about in the previous Zoomcast about Theodore Roosevelt, the man, the person. Because once you get to know him as a person, you have a better perspective of what he was like as president. Next guide question. And again, this is not a lot, it's a relatively short video. I want you to describe his physical stature, his physique. Remember, I kind of talked a little bit about that growing up. He had asthma as a little boy, and what his father, Theodore Sr., suggested he do. What about his diet? They mentioned what he had for breakfast. What he used to eat. And what type of physical activities did he participate in? It's pretty astounding and remarkable what this, I mean, he truly, as they mentioned in the video, a Renaissance person, a Renaissance president, meaning that he was good at and dabbled in a lot of different things. He wasn't just a really, really, really smart individual, but physically, what he did was it's truly remarkable. He was a man way ahead of his time. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you direct your attention up to my, of course, screen, this video is about 3 minutes and 45 seconds long. Theodore Roosevelt, courtesy of PBS and Ken Burns.
I wonder how a man so thick-set, of rather abdominal contour, with eyes heavily spectacled, could have so much an air of magic and wild romance about him, could give one so stirring an impression of adventure and chivalry. The Metropolitan Magazine.
Fueled by cup after cup of coffee, served to him in a special mug his eldest son said was as big as a bathtub, Theodore Roosevelt raced through his day. Letters were answered upon receipt, a lifetime total of 150,000, dictated to shifts of weary stenographers.
Jefferson wrote 22,000 letters, and we regard him as one of the great correspondents in American history. Roosevelt wrote at least 150,000 letters. He's the writingest president in American history, by far. And a number of his books are American classics. So he's an intellectual. He read a book a day, sometimes 3 books in a day when he had some leisure. You think of Jefferson as America's Renaissance man, but it's really Roosevelt.
He would not stop talking. He was a one-man gas bag. But it was so interesting that most people didn't mind. One of my favorite stories is he heard there was a famous big game hunter in Washington. He said to some of the people on the staff, "Get that man over here. I'd really like to meet him." So this big, strapping English fellow was taken into the president's office. The door was closed, and people outside the office heard this talking going on. Finally, the man emerged about an hour and a half later, looking just beat down as though he'd been through a storm. And one of the president's staff said, "What did you tell the president?" He said, "I told him my name."
We love him because of the energy. His laugh was infectious. His son Ted said, "My father had a dozen eggs for breakfast every morning." So he's a large man, and he's larger than life. Roosevelt once said, "There's nothing quite so exhilarating as being thrown over the shoulders of a 300-pound Japanese man." He played all these wild games in the White House. He wrestled with diplomats. He played a game called Single Stick with Leonard Wood, in which they would wrap themselves up in cushions and then beat the living daylights out of each other with sticks until Roosevelt had to stop.
He boxed with a young aide, too, until a blow caused him to lose vision in his left eye. Accordingly, I thought it better to acknowledge that I had become an elderly man and would have to stop boxing, he remembered. I then took up jiu-jitsu for a year or 2. Photographers were forbidden to cover his daily tennis games because he thought voters considered tennis a rich man's pastime. But when a cameraman failed to capture his horse jumping over an obstacle, he was more than happy to make the jump again. Roosevelt bit me, the editor William Allen White said, and I went mad.
Again, a truly remarkable individual. First bodybuilding president, boxer in college. You heard the story how he lost the sight of his left eye after he took a shot to the eye. He was boxing one of his aides who was a really good boxer. Jiu-jitsu, the first martial arts president. Holy shnikes, Theodore Roosevelt did it all. All right, and then one quick little side note. His daughter, Alice Lee, had a great description of her father. She used to say, because remember, Theodore Roosevelt loved the limelight. He loved the spotlight. He loved the attention. Of all the presidents, you go back over 100 years ago, which president would fit in well today with social media? There's no doubt in my mind it would have been Theodore Roosevelt. He absolutely would have been actively posting on social media. Alice Lee once described her father. She said, "My father's, quote, the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral." Think about that quote. What a great description of Theodore Roosevelt. All right, so here's what I want you to do. Now go back those 2 pages. And what I want you to do is let's get into his accomplishments, shall we? All right, so please write this down. So remember, all the bullet notes, when you see it, you write it down, and we're going to really start working more on oral note taking. That's one thing we need to work on is adding information to the bullet notes you're writing down. So as President of the United States of America and the first progressive president, the 26th president from 1901 through 1909, Theodore Roosevelt was responsible for 8 major accomplishments. We're not going to do all 8. I'm going to cherry pick the ones that I think are the most significant, relevant, important, and again, give you guys a little bit more background information on each and every one of the ones that I do cover with you. All right, so number one, this is a big one because it ties in with him being the first of our progressive presidents. So Theodore Roosevelt, one of the things he's remembered for as an accomplishment as president is his reputation as being a trust buster. Now remember, trusts are a little bit different than monopolies. A monopoly is when you got one company like Standard Oil that basically dominates an industry. A trust is when you have a group of companies that kind of join together, run by a group of individuals, we call them trustees, and they basically work in sync and really don't compete with each other in order to eliminate other competition. Now, a couple of key points about Roosevelt. So number one, Roosevelt really was the first American president. Now, again, we had 25 before him between George Washington and William McKinley. He was really the first president to become concerned about the growth of monopolies and trust. And he was really the first president who believed it was his duty and responsibility to do something about it. Now, another thing about Roosevelt is that he made a distinction. Roosevelt used to say there's a difference between good trusts and bad trusts. And Roosevelt felt that as president, it was not his job or responsibility to break up a good trust. He said he would focus on the bad trust, meaning he would focus on the trust that he felt were adversely and negatively impacting the American people. He felt if a trust was not doing that, he would basically leave them alone. Now, one of the other things about him being a trust buster, and I would draw a line off the side, you might want to add this as a side oral note. In actuality, his successor, William Howard Taft, he had far more trust that he had broken up than Theodore Roosevelt, dramatically more. But yet, it's Theodore Roosevelt, he's the one that everybody associates as being the trust buster. But in actuality, it was William Howard Taft who technically broke up more trust than Roosevelt did. So again, Roosevelt made that distinction between the good trust and the bad trust. And I would make a little line off to the side. The bad trusts were ones he went after because they were the ones he felt were negatively impacting the American people. So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, this is a famous political cartoon of Theodore Roosevelt, who was a hunter. And again, you notice in the background, you see these bear cubs, and you see on the back of one, it says bad trust. It ties in with his feelings about good and bad trust, and also Theodore Roosevelt's reputation as a big game hunter. Moving on. So who is one of the biggest, again, game, if you will, we're going to stick with that metaphor that Roosevelt went after, and it's that guy. So in 1902, this is a year after Roosevelt became president of the United States, after he took over after William McKinley was assassinated. So in 1902, Theodore Roosevelt goes after a pretty big fish. His name is J.P. Morgan, one of the infamous and one of the great, of course, robber barons. Remember, Morgan started out in banking. He heavily invested in Thomas Edison and, of course, the electric incandescent light bulb. In addition, Morgan is going to buy out Carnegie, remember, in 1901, and took Carnegie Steel and made it U.S. Steel. And also, J.P. Morgan was part of what's called the Northern Securities Company. So the Northern Securities Company was a company that would go and invest in other companies, in other industries, buy up the stock. And if you own more than 50% of the stock, you own the company. And one of the areas he really tried to control was the railroad industry. So I would draw a line off to the side. So Morgan, through the Northern Securities Company, controlled the railroads basically from Chicago, the hub of the country in the middle, all the way to California. So again, if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, so because of the fact that J.P. Morgan controlled the railroads, again, this is something that bothered Roosevelt. And so the bottom line is Theodore Roosevelt will have a meeting with J.P. Morgan. And Morgan figured that, I could have a conversation with Roosevelt and we would work this out, and Roosevelt would leave him alone the way William McKinley left him alone, the way Grover Cleveland left him alone. And that's not going to happen. Roosevelt basically told Morgan, no, we're going to break you up, because Roosevelt accused J.P. Morgan and the Northern Securities Company of breaking what's called the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. That was one of your key content terms from Notebook Guide number 13. Now, again, the Sherman Antitrust Act, you should draw a line off to the side. That was the law that basically stated that, again, trusts and monopolies were illegal and the government had a right to break them up. The problem was the language was a little vague in terms of trade and what exactly does that mean? And then remember, initially it was used against labor unions, like in the Pullman strike. Roosevelt decides to focus and use the Sherman Antitrust Act, what it was intended to do, which was to regulate and break up, if necessary, trusts and monopolies. So, ladies and gentlemen, what's going to happen? The end result is Roosevelt is going to sue JP Morgan and the Northern Securities Company. The lawsuit eventually is going to go up to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court is eventually going to rule that, yes, JP Morgan and, of course, the Northern Securities Company was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was an illegal trust, a monopoly, actually more specifically. And as a result, the federal government, more specifically, it will be the Supreme Court, enforced by the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, must be broken up. This is a huge victory for the American people. And this is really showing how Theodore Roosevelt is stepping out as being the first of the progressive presidents. You would have never seen Willie McKinley or, again, his predecessor, Grover Cleveland, doing something like that. So, ladies and gentlemen, this was an absolute shock to JP Morgan. Morgan, remember, back in 1894, had bailed out the United States government during a depression. It was on the brink of collapsing with a $45 million loan. So he figured he had a little bit of collateral here. And you know what? He forgot who he's dealing with. He's dealing with, figuratively speaking, metaphorically speaking, the big game hunter, Theodore Roosevelt. So Roosevelt's next target now, always just getting warmed up. And so his next target was even a bigger prey, if you will. And that, of course, is Standard Oil. So yeah, so then Roosevelt's going to go after John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. I'm certain that Roosevelt had to have read, because he was such a voracious reader. Remember, a book a day? Some people don't read a book a year. He can read sometimes 3 a day. That's astounding to me. And so basically, I'm really convinced he read Ida Tarbell's The History of the Standard Oil Company, and he decided we got to take action. So eventually what's going to happen is Standard Oil will be broken up in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, but in 1911. So actually, it wasn't Roosevelt who did it. It was his successor, William Howard Taft, who broke up Standard Oil. But Roosevelt set the wheels into motion for it. That's why I think he really was given the nickname Trust Buster, even though technically Taft did create it, or let me rephrase that. Taft broke up a lot more trust monopolies than Roosevelt did. All right, moving on, number 2. So another major accomplishment of Roosevelt's presidency is what we call the square deal. So when Theodore Roosevelt ran for the presidency in 1904, now remember, folks, when he originally ran for the presidency, he didn't run. He ran as a vice president in 1900. He was the running mate of Willie McKinley. McKinley's assassinated in 1901. Roosevelt takes over. So now in 1904, Roosevelt is now running for the presidency of the United States. So when he ran on what he called a square deal. And basically, if you write this down, the square deal, in my mind, my interpretation of it, is he believed it was the duty and responsibility of the federal government to provide all Americans an opportunity. It's kind of like a little bit, maybe it's a bad analogy, but I was thinking about Andrew Carnegie and the Gospel of Wealth, when Carnegie said it was the duty of rich people to take once you make all your money, to create opportunities for people. So Roosevelt's just basically saying now it's the job of the federal government to look out for the American people and give you opportunities to be successful. Now in TCI, they'll talk about how Roosevelt felt that the square deal was also an opportunity for the federal government to regulate big business and to really look out in the best interest for the American people, which is true. But to me, the square deal was, it's about opportunity. And Roosevelt believed it was his responsibility as president to provide every American an opportunity for success. So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, this is a campaign button in which Roosevelt's promising a square deal, but notice the year, 1912. So Roosevelt actually runs for the presidency again. He's going to win in 1904. He's not going to run in 1908, but he does run in 1912, and he ends up losing that election to the last of our progressive presidents, Dr. Thomas Woodrow Wilson. So let me give you two examples of Roosevelt providing a square deal. Number one, a great example of Roosevelt providing a square deal to somebody. Remember, the key word is opportunity. So it has to be, you got to look at somebody like a Booker T. Washington. So if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that's Booker T. Washington. Oh, I will definitely be talking a lot about Mr. Washington when we get to the civil rights movement in the spring, in April of 2022. So Booker T. Washington is one of the pioneers of the civil rights movement. But it's more than just that. Booker T. Washington is the very first African-American to actually have dinner in the White House, not serve dinner, but actually sit down and have dinner with the President of the United States of America. So yes, Theodore Roosevelt extended an invitation to Booker T. Washington. No president before Theodore Roosevelt had ever done anything like that. That's progressive. That's thinking outside the box. And that's providing somebody, in this case, Booker T. Washington, a square deal. Another great example is number two, Oscar S. Strauss. So if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, that's of course Oscar S. Strauss. Now, why is Oscar S. Strauss a great example of a square deal? Because Theodore Roosevelt had appointed Oscar S. Strauss as our nation's Secretary of Commerce. Commerce is trade. And he was also appointed Secretary of Labor. Labor is responsible for, again, looking out for the well-being of the workers, the coal miners, the factory workers, the skilled workers, the unskilled workers. So you have to ask the question, so why would Oscar S. Strauss be an example of a square deal? Because Oscar S. Strauss wore the Star of David. He was Jewish. He was a Jewish American. And Oscar S. Strauss is the very first Jewish American to serve in a president's cabinet. That, again, is a great example of Theodore Roosevelt thinking outside the box and truly being progressive. Let's continue on. Number three, another major accomplishment of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is the very first American president to mediate a labor strike. So mediate means you've got two sides. You got the workers and you got the owners, the bosses, and they can't find common ground. They can't agree. They can't reach a compromise. So the mediator comes in, listens to two sides, and basically negotiates a truce, an agreement, if you will. Now, in order to understand the significance of this, I have to give you guys a little history, no pun intended. So we have to go back to that guy. That's, again, a guy by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. He was our 19th president of the United States from 1877. He stepped down in 1881. Now, in 1877, during Rutherford B. Hayes' first year as president, he's going to send federal troops in to stop a rail strike. Remember, that was one of the big strikes we learned about in chapter 14. So what you see at this point is the president of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, taking the side of the owners, the big business, if you will. Then you've got Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was our 22nd and 24th president. He was president from 1885 to 1889. He lost the election of 1888 to Benjamin Hayes, ran for the presidency again in 1892, and became president again. So Grover Cleveland has the distinction of being the only president to have two non-consecutive terms. He won a term, he lost, and then he came back and won again. So in 1894, in Grover Cleveland's second term as president, he also was going to send in federal troops to break up a strike. In this instance was the Pullman strike, because he believed that the striking workers of the Pullman Company were interfering with trade, and therefore they were in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So the point I'm making is both former presidents Grover Cleveland and Rutherford B. Hayes, they're not taking the side of the workers. They're taking the side of management. So now we're going to fast forward to 1902. And in 1902, in Roosevelt's first year as president, you have what's called the anthracite coal strike. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, that's a photograph that was taken in 1902 of the coal miners who had gone on strike. And you notice some of these coal miners are awfully young. A lot of young boys worked as coal miners. So in 1902, over 150,000 coal miners of the United Mine Workers Union will go on strike. So the question is, why are they going on strike? Well, why is it usually that workers decide to walk off the job? That's a labor strike. And what it usually comes down to is the combination of three things. It's usually one, two, three, or usually all three combined. So number one, they wanted better wages. They were making horrible money. Remember that, again, one of the graphs you did with chapter 13? And remember how coal miners were making less than $1,000 a year, and there was Andrew Carnegie making $25 million a year? They wanted better working conditions. As dangerous as it was working in a factory, it was probably even more dangerous working in a coal mine. And number three, now here's a new one for you. They wanted union recognition. The owners of the anthracite coal mine would not recognize the right for the workers, the coal miners, to form a union known as the United Mine Workers Union. So what's going to happen? Roosevelt again is going to come in. The first time a president really comes in to mediate a strike. Yeah, you've got Rutherford B. Hayes and Grover Cleveland became involved, but they really weren't mediating. They just simply sent troops in to end the strike. In the case of Roosevelt, he's not going to send troops in. He's going to bring both sides to the table to talk and then listen to their two sides and then try to resolve it with a solution, a compromise. But here's where Roosevelt, again, thinks outside the box. This is why he's the first progressive president. Because what Roosevelt does is Roosevelt's going to side with labor, not with management. And number two, Theodore Roosevelt does not use federal troops to end the strike, unlike Rutherford B. Hayes did, and of course, going back to Grover Cleveland. So this is setting precedents. This is setting an example for future presidents. This is why Roosevelt's ranked as one of the most influential presidents of all time, because he's doing things that the previous 25 presidents never even thought of or did. As a matter of fact, Roosevelt believed that coal miners were right, and they also deserved to earn a 10% raise. So now they're making $600 a year. They were making $600, I should say. So 10% of $600 is $60. So now they're making $660 a year. Now it's still not great, but $660 is still better than $600. Let's continue on. Next major accomplishment of Roosevelt. Let's talk about the jungle. So remember, Theodore Roosevelt was a prolific reader. We know he read Ida Tarbell's The History of the Standard Oil Company. That had to be the impetus why, one of the reasons why he went after John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil for being in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, because Standard Oil was indeed a monopoly. Roosevelt, like a lot of Americans, read Upton Sinclair's seminal work, The Jungle. Remember, it was about the fictional account of the meatpacking industry in Chicago, but it really wasn't fictional because remember, Sinclair had secretly snuck in and was making observations about what was really going on in the meatpacking industry. The filthy, horrible, dangerous conditions, the sick animals that were being slaughtered, that were being consumed by the American people. So once again, Roosevelt reads this book. Roosevelt, like a lot of Americans, was stunned by this. How can this be happening in the United States of America? So after reading Upton Sinclair's seminal work, The Jungle, in 1906, Roosevelt goes to Congress and says, we need to take action. I need you to pass a bill. I want to sign it into law. So what happens is Congress in 1906 is going to pass a bill. It is signed into law by President Theodore Roosevelt, or Roosevelt, whichever you prefer, and it's called the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. I would argue, in a good way, not a negative, pejorative way, I would argue in a good way, this is one of the most important pieces of legislation ever signed by an American president. I'd rank it in the top 5. I really believe that. And when you talk about, well, why do I have to study what happens 120 years ago? The reason why food that we consume today and the medicines we take today to help us get better, that goes back to this law. That's why we study the past. So what exactly did the Pure Food and Drug Act do? So to me, there were 2 key components of it that you're going to need to know for your major assessment. So number 1, so what's going to happen is a new agency is going to be created as a result of the Pure Food and Drug Act. It's called the FDA. The FDA is called the Food and Drug Administration. That should sound familiar to you because the Food and Drug Administration had to initially make the decision to either approve or disapprove of our vaccines in dealing with COVID. Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. And then from there, it goes to the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. So again, thinking about what the relevance is of something that happened 120 years ago or so, how it impacts us today, here's a great example. So now you have this new agency, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So guess what they're going to now do? They're now going to regulate the meatpacking industry, making certain that some of the issues that Upton Sinclair wrote about in The Juggle will no longer apply. So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, things like more humane treatment of the animals. It's still not great, but it's a lot better now the way animals are treated in terms of when prepared for the slaughterhouses, if you will. It's better, and it's better because of Roosevelt and the Pure Food and Drug Act under the auspices of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. But here's another point, number two. The Food and Drug Administration also is going to regulate all drugs and medicines. Because remember, folks, prior to this, anybody could go out there and advertise some type of narcotic or drug and claim it's going to make you better. But nobody ever tested it to see that it actually worked. That's why, again, you feel comfortable having a vaccine because you know it's been thoroughly tested by the FDA and approved ultimately by the CDC. Not over 120 years ago, you might be taking something that's absolutely useless. Or conversely, some companies were marketing drugs that are very addictive. Opium, cocaine, things that we know are very, very dangerous, morphine. But now it's being regulated. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, so because of what Roosevelt did with the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, that's why people are now safely having vaccines, whether it's Pfizer, Moderna, or Johnson & Johnson. So there's your connection between 2021 and 1906. Let's move on. Another major accomplishment of Roosevelt. Let's talk about the promotion of conservation. Whenever I think of conservation, now granted, the very first national park was actually created, Yellowstone, back when Ulysses S. Grant was our 18th president. But he's not really remembered as a conservation president. That title has to go to Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, ladies and gentlemen, is really the very first American president to actively and progressively, no pun intended, promote conservation. And we'll talk a little bit more about conservation in a moment. But what we need to also understand and recognize is who is responsible for motivating Roosevelt to really be that first president. That's why Roosevelt's the first of our progressive presidents, because he's thinking outside the box. No president before him ever promoted conservation. So this is due to two individuals, not two presidents, two individuals. Number one, here's our old friend, Robert La Follette, former governor, of course, of Wisconsin, future senator from the great state of Wisconsin, was really the first governor of a state, and in this instance, Wisconsin, our neighbors to the north, that actively promoted conservation. Huge influence on Theodore Roosevelt. And number two, he is considered to be the father of conservation in the United States of America. And his name, of course, is John Muir. If you direct your attention to the overhead screen, that's a photograph of John Muir. Again, I would agree he's the father of American conservation, born in Scotland, moved to the United States around the age of 11, lived for a time in Wisconsin, and then later on will work his way west. He was one of the individuals responsible for one of the great national parks. It's called Yosemite National Park. And when you talk about conservation, what are we talking about? We're talking about conserving water. We're talking about conserving land. We're talking about conserving and taking care of the animals, being good stewards of the land. And what about the air we breathe? Things that we too often and too frequently take for granted. This all goes back to, again, Robert La Follette. John Muir was huge. And of course, now you've got a president that's actively pushing the envelope for it. So ladies and gentlemen, if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, John Muir was responsible for, again, basically setting this land aside that's called Yosemite National Park. As a matter of fact, when you talk about national parks, this is land that's set aside, again, for the American people. It's owned by the taxpayers of this country. Theodore Roosevelt, in 8 years as president of the United States of America, set aside over 150 million acres of land was set aside for national parks, like Yosemite National Park. Muir Woods, which was named after John Muir, up north of San Francisco. This is all because of Theodore Roosevelt. Let's continue on. Ladies and gentlemen, here's another significant accomplishment of Roosevelt. Number 6, I want to talk about Theodore Roosevelt being the very first American president. This is huge. Winning the Nobel Peace Prize. Setting precedents. No American president ever won one before. So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, that of course is an emblem of Alfred Nobel, a Swedish scientist. This is what the award is named after. You can win in the area of science, you can win it in medicine, you can win it in literature, and most importantly, you can win it in promoting the cause of peace. So in 1905, Theodore Roosevelt negotiated a treaty that officially ended a war, which I'll talk about in a moment. It's called the Treaty of Portsmouth. This was the very first war that was fought at the beginning of the 20th century. It's called the Russo-Japanese War. You might learn about it next year when you guys are taking world history at Stevenson High School. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, this is again a political cartoon. So here's Roosevelt acting as the mediator, just like he did when he mediated the anthracite coal strike. This gentleman represents the Tsar, Nicholas II, and this represents the leader of Japan. And as a result of negotiating this treaty, which ended the first modern 20th century war, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American president to actually win one. Future presidents who will win the Nobel Peace Prize will include Woodrow Wilson, James Earl Carter, also known as Jimmy Carter, and of course, former President Barack Obama. And by the way, for winning the Nobel Peace Prize, Theodore Roosevelt won $36,000 and $735. Pretty good big money back in the day. Let's continue on. This is another huge accomplishment of Theodore Roosevelt. Number 7, let's talk about digging the Panama Canal. So Theodore Roosevelt, in order to understand the digging of the Panama Canal, we got to go back to something I mentioned when I gave some interesting facts. And it has to go back to Alfred T. Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote a very important work called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History back in 1890. Roosevelt read that amongst all the other books he read. Mahan was the one who said, the key to becoming a superpower is not your army, it's your navy. And Roosevelt read that book and took it to heart. So one of the things that Roosevelt wanted to do was to basically give the United States the right to dig a canal. So in 1901, the United States is going to negotiate what's called the Hay-Ponce-Fonte Treaty. And what this treaty did was it allowed the United States now the ability to actually go and dig a canal through a country called Panama. And so as a result of the treaty of Hay-Ponce-Fonte Treaty, the United States is going to embark upon a huge engineering endeavor. What we're going to try to do is create a canal that's going to allow the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans to connect by water. Otherwise, if you wanted to go from the Pacific to the Atlantic or the Atlantic to the Pacific, you'd have to sail all the way around the very southern tip of South America and come up again. This would eliminate, again, days and weeks from your voyage. So if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, this again is a map illustrating the Panama Canal. So this blue line represents the Panama Canal itself. Now here's one that's for you. Did you know this one? So when you think about it, we know that the Pacific Ocean is to the west. It's on the west coast, right? San Francisco, San Diego, where I was a couple of weeks ago. East coast, of course, the Atlantic Ocean, New York City, Boston, Charleston. But here's a little geographical fun point for you. When you look at where the Panama Canal is dug, this is on an isthmus. An isthmus is an area of land that connects two bigger pieces of land. And in this instance, it separates two bodies of water. So if you look at where the isthmus of Panama is and where they dug the Panama Canal, notice the Pacific Ocean is east. The Caribbean Ocean, which empties into the Atlantic Ocean, is actually west. It was finally officially completed in 1914, and it was officially opened in 1921. Let's continue on, or 1920, actually. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on. So finally, this will be the last major accomplishment I want to share with you guys. And the last major accomplishment I want to share with you, and it ties in with the digging of the Panama Canal, absolutely, has to deal with what we call the Roosevelt corollary and big stick diplomacy. This again is Theodore Roosevelt setting precedents, setting an example. This is why Roosevelt's considered to be one of the most influential presidents. So remember I shared this political cartoon with you on the previous Zoomcast. This is again Theodore Roosevelt leading what's called the Great White Fleet. And this is what we call big stick diplomacy. So Roosevelt's foreign policy was basically to make an adjustment on what's called the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine you learned about last year from wonderful Miss Choi and exciting Mr. Herrera, 1823. This was the foreign policy that was created by James Monroe. It was actually the idea of his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. And basically it was a warning. The Monroe Doctrine basically told the European powers, the French and especially the Spanish, to stay out of Latin America. This was in our area, our sphere of influence, and not to get involved. What Roosevelt's going to do is he's going to alter or adjust the Monroe Doctrine. This is called basically a corollary or an addition to something, the Roosevelt corollary. And so now the Roosevelt corollary, which is basically taking the Monroe Doctrine and tweaking it and adjusting it and adding on to it. So now it's basically not only a warning telling Europe, in this instance, Great Britain and Germany, to stay out of Latin America, Central and South America. But now Roosevelt is saying the United States has every right, if it determines that its interests are impacted in any way, shape, or form by, again, some type of bad political or social or economic situation in a country in Latin America, that would be Central and South America, or even the islands of the Caribbean, the United States has that right to step in and get involved. And so this then ties in with Roosevelt building what's called the Great White Fleet to basically defend and support our interests in Latin America. And remember, he sent it on a world tour at the end of his second term as president as a warning to the countries of Europe. And really, I think it was primarily Germany that the United States was stepping out as a world power, as the police. Speak softly and always carry a big stick. So when you talk again about Latin America, folks, we're talking about Central America, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. You're talking about islands in the Caribbean, like again, the Dominican Republic, Cuba. And you're talking about South America, Venezuela, Colombia, here's Panama. And there, of course, is the Panama Canal. And again, in one of those weird juxtapositions, so here's the Caribbean Sea, which is part of the Atlantic Ocean. This is west. There's the Pacific Ocean east. Pretty cool, huh? All right, ladies and gentlemen, at this point, we're going to have to wrap it up. So what's my final grade for Theodore Roosevelt? Yes, he's a great president. He's my favorite president to talk about. I admit it. I'm being partial. But again, when you just look at objectively the things that Roosevelt did in terms of setting precedents, the trust busting, conservation, the Roosevelt corollary, this addendum, this foreign policy adjustment to the Monroe Doctrine, building the Great White Fleet, getting more actively involved in world affairs, negotiating the end of the Russo-Japanese War, Theodore Roosevelt ends up with an A. Theodore Roosevelt goes down in our top 5, one of the greatest American presidents in history. He's usually ranked number 4 or number 5. Theodore Roosevelt was truly a remarkable person and an outstanding president. So, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. My last direct instruction on Unit 1. I know it's a little bit lengthier, but the beauty of the Zoomcast is you had the opportunity of finishing it up later on. So here's what you need to do. Correctable tape. Now you're going to go and you're going to clean up. I don't want to see any crossing out or tracing over. Make certain also, in addition, take multiple colored highlighters. I need more than just the fluorescent. Tip of the tip. Go through the guide questions, the notes you took, the direct instructional notes, your oral notes, the bullet notes. Focus on those words you can visualize in your mind, the persons, places, and things. Don't be highlighting everything. If you're not highlighting, you're not studying. And if you're not studying, you're not practicing, developing your skills in school to be a successful student. And therefore, you're not going to do well in your assessments. That's what we're trying to get you guys ready for high school. So you will be, again, the leaders of Adelaide Stevenson High School. Please remember, got to review your ISN 10 to 15 minutes every day. You practice for soccer, you practice for basketball, you never complain. Why aren't you practicing for school? And please hand your ISN to somebody in your house, your mom, your dad, maybe an older brother or sister who once had me, maybe an aunt or an uncle that had me decades ago. You channel your inner Mr. Bonk. You teach them the information. You explain to them the different things that Theodore Roosevelt did as our first progressive president. Things like, again, trust busting, negotiating the end of a labor strike, the anthracite coal strike, the first conservation president, the first American president to win the Nobel Peace Prize, the president responsible for the Panama Canal, and the president responsible for beginning to change America's foreign policy through the Roosevelt corollary. Speak softly and always carry a big stick. Ladies and gentlemen, again, I hope you enjoyed the Zoomcast as much as I personally love making these. I'm going to keep doing it for the duration of the year. And as I always like to say, you know, the story may have ended today, but you better believe the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much. And as always, be well.